Hello everyone! In this video I'm going to talk about a critical step when using food composition data or compiling a food composition database, that is food matching. My name is Fernanda Grande and I'm here to share some knowledge and experiences with you. And if you are a food composition data user or a compiler, this channel will be very useful for you, so thanks for being here. So let's start. I will explain what food matching is, show some challenges and the guidelines developed by FAO and INFOODS for food matching. So let's start understanding what food matching is. When we say food matching, we are referring to the activity that links foods from different data sets. So it can be either linking food consumption or supply data with food composition data to allow for nutrient intake estimates, or it can also be linking foods and nutrient profiles from two different data sets. And this is a very important step during the elaboration of food composition databases for data aggregation, such as when we are combining the available data to calculate an average value, or also when we are borrowing data from different food composition tables to fill the missing values in our database. So when we are performing the food matching, we need to keep in mind that it is extremely important to ensure that foods from different data sets are as similar as possible so that the food composition data of one data set corresponds to the other food in the other data set. For example, if we are dealing with food consumption data. And this is why food matching procedures are critical for obtaining high-quality estimations of nutrient intakes, and also for food composition databases, since most of them combine or borrow values from different sources of data. But as food consumption and composition databases describe and classify data using distinct criteria, it makes of food matching a difficult and challenging task. So let me give you a couple of examples to make it more clear. Foods may be not precisely described in food consumption surveys, especially in household surveys. But of course that the details included in the food description vary a lot among the different surveys, depending on their characteristics and purpose. So having that said, let's suppose that we find this food in a food consumption survey, being unknown type, dried, boiled, and that we need to match this food to another one in a food composition database. So I took the FAO INFOODS Global Food Composition Database for pulses and selected all the foods that could match the food described in our hypothetical survey. So I found 12 different types of dried, or also called mature beans, in this case they mean the same, that were also boiled. And in the food composition database we find additional details. So for example, for all beans, we have that they were water soaked and boiled in a different water. And in addition, for each of these entries, we have the option to choose the food that was boiled and then the excess of water was drained or not. Therefore, in this case, we need to decide how to match the foods. So, should we take an average of all beans available in the food composition table? Or should we choose just the ones that are known as the most consumed ones and according to the most common cooking practice for the given population? So, these are some options that we may have for this food, for matching this food. And here we have another example when we find a very specific food description in our hypothetical survey. It can also be difficult to find the exact food in food composition tables and databases. So I took the same food composition table, and for lentil brown dried stewed with butter, I could find only these two matchings that may be the best or the closest options to match to this food. So as you can see here, when I look at the food composition database, I could identify the two potential foods to match, but you can also see that some details in the descriptions differ. And the most important is that these details, they affect a lot the composition of the given foods, such as the added butter that is described that will result in a different fat content. And if the lentil is, for example, whole or split, which affects the dietary fiber content. So in both examples that I'm bringing here to you, we need to make a decision about the best procedure to match the different foods. And these decisions can change from food to food and also depending on the information available in the surveys and also in the food composition database. But it's important to keep in mind that some rules need to be set to allow for a standardized food matching procedure. So during the food matching, it's important to keep in mind two aspects. So first, the food matching should always aim to the highest quality matching, and usually by identifying the most appropriate food in the most appropriate source of food composition data. And also, to properly access the nutrient intake, there can be no missing values in the food composition data. So if a value is missing for a component, a new food matching must be made. It might seem simple, right? So the foods should be equivalent and we shouldn't have any missing data. But anybody who has worked with food matching will agree that this may be a very challenging task and that it's not always possible to achieve a high quality match. So as food matching procedures are critical to obtaining high quality estimations of nutrient intake estimates, FAO and INFOODS developed the guidelines for food matching for a more harmonized procedure and to point out critical steps and information in order to achieve the most appropriate food matching. And these guidelines were developed with the contribution of a group of experts. These guidelines were intended to assist in selecting the most appropriate foods to match to the foods reported in food consumption surveys. But they are also very useful when compiling food composition tables or databases during the data aggregation from different sources and also when filling data gaps. So to prepare this guideline, a call of experts for establishing the guidelines was issued via the INFOODS mail list, and they were guided by an FAO coordinator who was responsible for preparing the first draft of the guidelines. And this document was circulated among the experts via email, who reviewed and added suggestions to the document several times until developing the final document. So the first part of the guidelines lists the general aspects on food matching, which includes some key aspects that should be taken into consideration before starting the food matching process. So let's see here one by one. So first, we need to identify the food components of interest. The decisions on food matching will depend on the food component of interest for the survey. So for example, if a survey is interested in vitamin A intake, it is of great importance that all factors affecting the vitamin A content on foods are taken into consideration. On the other hand, if a survey doesn't look at sodium content, for example, then it also doesn't matter if the salted or unsalted foods are matched. The identification of the components of interest is also important for selecting the food composition database, since it's necessary to consider the components available in the chosen food composition table. And if a component is missing, the values will need to be inputted from another food composition table. So all these criteria need to be set before starting the food matching. Second, we need to identify the amount of foods consumed. This will help us to decide on the priority foods for matching, and this is necessary because food matching is a very time-consuming activity, and sometimes the efforts need to be directed to the most relevant foods. So this means that foods consumed in significant quantities or with high concentrations of the components of interest should be considered as priority, while a lower quality food match is more acceptable for foods that are consumed in minor amounts or that don't contribute a lot for the components of interest. The third criteria, for foods that are not clearly described in the surveys, it is important to identify the population of interest and their habits to attribute the best food match. In some cases, it is important also to identify several possible food matches, especially for foods of high consumption, to represent what is consumed in the country. And fourth, it is important to document the food matching. So assigning quality codes is very useful to access the quality of the food matching and hence of the nutrient intake estimations. So we can classify the quality of the food matching using, for example, these criteria available in the guidelines. So we can say that a food matching has the quality code A for a high quality food matching, meaning that this is an exact match. And it includes not only all the descriptors for the food, but also the definition of the components. We can have a quality code B for a medium quality matching, and this can be used, for example, when we have a matching by an average value of different foods. So when we have a more generic food description and then we select more than one food to match and take the average. It can also be attributed to a matching done by recipe calculation. So if we don't find the recipe in food composition tables, we can make the recipe calculation. Or if I have a matching with a similar food, so meaning that some of the descriptors are not the same or not precisely described. And we can use the letter C for a low quality match. So when we, for example, have a food that is very different but is the closest match possible. So for example, if I have camel meat but in the food composition table I can find only beef, or if the definition of the components are not in accordance with the international quality standards. And depending on the circumstances, it can also be necessary to create subclasses for these quality codes to be more specific to the type of matching. So this is a good approach to access in an easy way the quality of the food matching performed. And the next section of the guidelines describe the food matching criteria itself. And here it calls our attention that the food matching should consider some key points not only in the food identification but also in the components, in the food components of interest. And let's start discussing about the food identification. So first, we need to consider the food name and the food descriptors. Ideally, they should be complete and unambiguous in both data sets To allow for a high quality food matching, it is important to consider that food names vary among countries, and some examples are groundnuts and peanuts, maize and corn, recipe and veg, and they refer to the same food. So it's important to consider these differences when compiling data, especially if we are using food composition tables from different countries. The next aspect is the scientific name. So, scientific names may be used during food matching, but they also can vary for the same food. So, for example, here I'm bringing a variety of scientific names that we can find for broad bean. So we can see that the first one in bold is the official one, but all the others may also be found in the literature. So when we are using the scientific name in the food matching, it is important to recognize these variations. And you can find the list of all the scientific names available for a certain food in many different websites, and I'm leaving here these two as a suggestion for you. Additionally to the food description and scientific name, it is important also to check the water and fat content as well as other components of interest. We need to check the water content for all foods to be sure that they match the food descriptions, while fat is important for foods where it varies a lot, such as milk and dairy products. Other components should also be checked depending on the components of interest. And here we have a list of categories of important descriptors that we need to consider during the food matching. So we have processing and preparation state of the food, color, biodiversity, maturity stage, part or source of the food, refuse or edible portion, and fortification or enrichment of processed food. So for each of these items, the guidelines bring some important questions that should be asked during the matching process. And let me just highlight here some for you. So first, I'm bringing here some issues regarding the processing and preparation state of the food. In this case, we need to pay attention if the food is raw, fresh, dried, processed, or prepared, since it will affect the complete nutrient profile of the food. And if we are looking at manufactured foods, we need to consider what is the impact of on the nutrient composition, such as added ingredients during the processing and also the preservation mean. The next aspect are color and maturity stage, and they may be related or not, since in some cases the color may indicate the maturity level of a certain food. Some components are related to the color of the food, such as vitamin A, where darker yellow or orange varieties of some plant-based foods are usually associated to a higher vitamin A content when we compare with the white or pale yellow ones. Regarding the maturity stage, it is important to consider if the food is ripe or unripe, especially for fruits, if they are in the immature or mature form, since it may dramatically change the nutrient content of foods. So for example, immature or fresh beans are completely different from the mature or dry beans, because the moisture content is very different between these foods, and it affects all the food components. And also we have to consider the age of the animal for this kind of foods. So for example, the composition of veal is different from the composition of the meat from beef. So the maturity stage and color are extremely important in the food matching. The next categories are part or source of the food and refuse or edible portion, and they also can influence all food components. They may vary also a lot from country to country or even from person to person. So, for example, thinking about the food part and edible portion, when we say just chicken, it can be chicken breast or chicken leg, with or without skin, or if we say fish, it can be whole or fillet only, with or without skin. So depending on the part consumed or refused, the nutrient composition will vary a lot. And last but not least, we have the food fortification. So the level of food fortification is country specific because of different standards in each country. Even for the same brand name, food fortification may be different among countries. Therefore, it is important to consider both mandatory and voluntary fortification practices when looking for food composition data. And to finish with this topic and to illustrate the importance of a complete food description, I'm bringing some practical examples. So if we have a food described as cassava raw, we can see that in the food composition table, it could be the tuber or the leaves. So the omission of the part of the food in the food description can lead to very different foods to match. In the second example, we have tuna canned drain. So it is missing the preservation mean. And when we look into the same food composition table, we can see that there are two possibilities. We have canned in water and canned in oil, and it affects a lot the fat content, but it will also change the micronutrient content. And in the third example, we have sweet potato flesh raw, and in this case the flesh color is missing. And looking at the food composition table, we can see that depending on the color of the sweet potato, we will have completely different values for vitamin A, meaning that it would be of great importance if vitamin A was one of the components of interest in the survey. So this is the problems that we can have when the food description is not complete, either in the food consumption survey or in the food composition table. And we need to be careful with these points. In addition, the guidelines also bring in the final part an annex with some examples of challenges that we can face during the food matching along with possible solutions. So this section can also serve as a guide for our decisions during the food matching, and I really recommend that you check carefully this part also. And the second key aspect in food matching is the food component. So in addition to the food identification, we always need to check the food component. And in this case, we need to check the component identification, the units, and denominator. So let's see more details here. So thinking about the component identification, we need to take into consideration that some components may have the same common name, but they can vary because of differences in the expression. So for example, if we have carbohydrate, express it as monosaccharide equivalents or by weight. Also, there are problems with different definitions. So, for example, vitamin A can be defined as retinol equivalent or retinol activity equivalent, and the values are completely different for plant-based foods. We also can have total or available carbohydrate, and they are also different definitions of carbohydrate. And we can also have difference due to the analytical method. So for fiber, for example, we can have crude fiber or the total dietary fiber, that are also completely different components. So we need to be very careful that so we don't mix all these different components, because they are not directly equivalent. And thinking about the component identification, we need to be careful, especially with energy, protein, carbohydrates, fat, fiber, vitamins A, D, E, C, folate, vitamin B6, and niacin. So with a big range of components, we need to be really careful and not mixing the different expressions, definitions, or analytical methods that may result in different values. But we also need to check the units and denominators, and when I say units, it's related to the units in which the data is expressed. So it can be gram, milligram, microgram, kilocalories or kilojoules for energy. And we also need to check the denominators. Usually in food composition tables, the values are presented per 100 grams of edible portion, but in some cases we can also find the values expressed per 100 mLs of total food for liquids, and in this case it is important to use the appropriate density conversion factor. The INFOODS components identifiers, called tag names, are very useful in the matching for components, and the main tag names for each component are listed on Annex 2 of the guidelines. When we see more than one tag name for a certain component, it means that different analytical methods, expressions, or definitions exist, and therefore we need to be careful to avoid mixing them. So assigning the tag names for the components when we are using more than one source of food composition data may be very helpful to avoid not appropriate mixtures. And finally, just to conclude, I'm listing here how I have been using the guidelines for food matching in my work experience. So I have been using to match data from food consumption or purchase surveys with food composition tables or food composition database. And this guideline is very useful for setting rules to make decisions using a standardized approach, and this is really important, especially when we are working in a group, so we have more than one person matching the foods. It's important that they follow the same approach. And also when we are matching foods from an unknown country, so it helps us to set rules and also to identify what is important to pay attention to. But the guidelines are also very useful during the compilation of food composition tables and databases, and it helped me on matching the foods during the data aggregation. So when we have a lot of data compiled from different data sources, we can choose the foods that we are going to put together and create an average value. But it's also important when we are filling the data gaps. So after making the data aggregation, and then when we need to borrow values from other food composition tables, the procedures described here also help us to choose the most appropriate foods to borrow values from. It's also useful to help us to think about all the descriptors that we need to add to make a complete food description, and also to decide the food entries that we will present. Well, so to summarize what we can find in the FAO INFOODS guidelines for food matching, we can find the key aspects that should be taken into consideration before starting the food matching process, and it also describes the key points for food matching, including the food identification and the component identification. And additionally, it gives some possible solutions for the challenges that we may face during the matching process. And here you can see again the group of experts that have prepared this very useful guideline. And if you don't know where you can find it, you can download this guideline directly from the FAO and INFOODS website, and I will leave the link here in the description of this video so you can easily access the guideline. Well, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you found value in it. And if you are interested in learning about food composition, you can find more information on my website, Food Composition Explained, and please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a thing. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to cover here, write here in the comments below. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.